Chapter 1. The Arrival. The town of Kickapoo was a place shrouded in mist and whispers. Tucked away in a remote corner of England, it was a village forgotten by time, where the cobblestone streets echoed with the footfalls of secrets and the air was thick with the scent of decay. It was here that Eliza Hawthorne found herself, a journalist seeking solace from the chaos of London, but drawn inexplicably to the eerie quiet of this forgotten place. Eliza had been sent to cover a story on the peculiar disappearance of several townsfolk over the past decade. The case had never made headlines, overshadowed by larger, more sensational news. But Eliza, driven by a curiosity she couldn't quite explain, had convinced her editor to let her investigate. As she stepped off the train, a sense of foreboding washed over her. The station was deserted, save for a lone station master who eyed her warily. "You must be Miss Hawthorne," he said in a gravelly voice. "Welcome to Kickapoo." Eliza nodded, her eyes scanning the empty platform. "Thank you. Is there someone to take me to the inn?" The station master shook his head. "No need. It's just down the road. Can't miss it." With that, he turned and disappeared into the station, leaving Eliza alone with her suitcase and the creeping fog that seemed to swallow everything in its path. She started walking, the silence pressing in on her. The village loomed ahead, its darkened windows like eyes watching her every move. Chapter 2. The Inn. The Kickapoo Inn was a decrepit building that looked as though it had been standing for centuries. The wooden sign creaked in the wind, and the paint was peeling off the walls. Eliza hesitated at the door, a chill running down her spine. She shook it off and entered, the door closing behind her with a heavy thud. Inside, the inn was dimly lit, with the flickering glow of oil lamps casting eerie shadows on the walls. The air was thick with the smell of damp wood and something else she couldn't quite place. At the counter stood a woman, her eyes dark and hollow. "Welcome," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You must be Miss Hawthorne. We've been expecting you." Eliza forced a smile. "Thank you. I'm here to cover a story." The woman nodded. "Of course. I'll show you to your room." As Eliza followed her up the creaking stairs, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Her room was small, with a single bed and a window that overlooked the village. She set her suitcase down and walked to the window, peering out into the fog. She could see the faint outlines of the houses, but nothing more. A knock on the door startled her. She turned to see the woman standing in the doorway. "Dinner will be served in an hour," she said, then disappeared down the hall. Eliza sighed, feeling the weight of the journey settle on her. She unpacked her things and sat on the bed, trying to shake the sense of unease that clung to her. As the hours ticked by, she couldn't help but feel that Kickapoo held more secrets than she could ever uncover. Chapter 3. The First Night. Dinner at the inn was a somber affair. The dining room was nearly empty, save for a few other guests who ate in silence. Eliza picked at her food, her mind racing with questions. She needed to find someone who could tell her more about the disappearances. As she was finishing her meal, a man approached her table. He was tall and gaunt, with a face lined by years of hardship. "Mind if I sit?" he asked. Eliza nodded. "Not at all." The man took a seat and extended his hand. "I'm Thomas Blackwood, the local historian." "Eliza Hawthorne," she replied, shaking his hand. "I'm here to investigate the disappearances." Thomas nodded, his eyes narrowing. "A dark business, that. The townsfolk don't like to talk about it, but I can tell you what I know." Eliza leaned forward, her interest piqued. "Please go on." Thomas glanced around the room, then lowered his voice. "It all started about 10 years ago. People began to vanish without a trace. No signs of struggle, no bodies found. Just gone." Eliza felt a shiver run down her spine. "And no one has any idea what happened to them?" Thomas shook his head. "There are rumors, of course. Some say the village is cursed. Others believe there's something in the woods, something ancient and malevolent." Eliza frowned. "What do you think?" Thomas hesitated. "I think there's more to this place than meets the eye. Kickapoo has a dark history, one that goes back centuries. There are stories of witchcraft, of forbidden rituals, and of a shadow that lurks in the forest. Eliza's curiosity burned brighter. I need to know more. Can you show me where the disappearances happened? Thomas nodded. I can. But be warned, Miss Hawthorne. Kickapoo is not a place for the faint of heart. Chapter 4. The Investigation. The next morning, Eliza and Thomas set out to visit the sites of the disappearances. The fog had lifted slightly, but the air was still thick with an unsettling quiet. As they walked through the village, Eliza couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The first stop was an old farmhouse on the outskirts of the village. The windows were boarded up, and the yard was overgrown with weeds. This was the home of the first victim, Thomas explained, a farmer named William Hargrave. He vanished one night while tending to his animals. His wife found the barn door open, but no sign of him. Eliza took notes, her mind racing with possibilities. And the others? Thomas led her to a small cottage near the forest. Mary Collins, a seamstress. She disappeared while fetching water from the well. Her bucket was found by the well, but she was never seen again. As they continued their tour, Eliza noticed a pattern. All the disappearances had occurred near the edge of the forest. Do you think the forest is connected to the disappearances? She asked. Thomas nodded. I do. There's something about those woods, something unnatural. The villagers avoid it at all costs. They say it's cursed. Eliza felt a chill run down her spine. I need to see it for myself. Thomas hesitated. It's not safe. Many have gone into those woods and never returned. I have to, Eliza insisted. It's the only way to find the truth. Reluctantly, Thomas agreed. Very well, but we must be careful. The forest is not a place to be taken lightly. Chapter 5. The Forest. The forest loomed ahead, its dark canopy casting long shadows on the ground. Eliza and Thomas stood at the edge, the air thick with tension. Are you sure about this? Thomas asked. Eliza nodded. I have to know. They stepped into the forest, the underbrush crunching beneath their feet. The air was cooler here, and the light filtered through the trees in strange, twisting patterns. As they ventured deeper, the sounds of the village faded away, replaced by an eerie silence. Eliza felt a growing sense of unease. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees towering like ancient sentinels. Do you feel that? She whispered. Thomas nodded. There's something here, something watching us. They continued on, their path winding deeper into the woods. Eliza's heart pounded in her chest, her senses on high alert. She could feel eyes on her, but every time she turned, there was nothing there. Suddenly, they came upon a clearing. In the center stood a stone altar, covered in strange, dark symbols. Eliza approached it cautiously, her eyes wide with curiosity. What is this? She asked. Thomas's face was pale. An old sacrificial altar. The villagers used to perform rituals here long ago. They believed it would appease the spirits of the forest. Eliza's mind raced. Do you think this is connected to the disappearances? Thomas nodded. It's possible. The forest holds many secrets, and not all of them are friendly. As Eliza examined the altar, she noticed something glinting in the underbrush. She reached down and picked up a small silver locket. Her heart skipped a beat. This belonged to one of the victims, she said, her voice trembling. Thomas's eyes widened. We need to leave. Now. But before they could move, a low growl echoed through the clearing. Eliza froze, her blood running cold. What was that? She whispered. Thomas's face was ashen. The shadow. It's here. Chapter 6. The Shadow. The growling grew louder, and Eliza felt a dark presence closing in around them. The shadows seemed to come alive, twisting and writhing like living things. We have to go, Thomas said urgently, grabbing her arm. They turned and ran, the forest a blur around them. Eliza's heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She could feel the shadow pursuing them, its malevolent energy pressing in on her. As they raced through the trees, Eliza stumbled and fell, the locket slipping from her grasp. Thomas pulled her to her feet, but it was too late. The shadow was upon them. It was a creature of pure darkness, its form shifting and indistinct. Eyes like burning coals glared at them from the void. It spoke in a voice that seemed to echo from the depths of the earth. "You should not have come here." Eliza felt a wave of terror wash over her. "What do you want?" she managed to whisper. The shadow laughed, a sound that sent shivers down her spine. "I want what was promised. The souls of the trespassers." Thomas stepped forward, his voice trembling. "We mean no harm. We only seek the truth." The shadow's eyes narrowed. "The truth? The truth is that this place is mine. The villagers made a pact long ago, and now they pay the price." Eliza's mind raced. What pact? The shadow's form shifted, becoming more solid, more menacing. A pact to protect the village from the darkness. But the price was high. A soul every year to keep the shadows at bay. Eliza felt a surge of anger. And the disappearances? The shadow's laugh was a low rumble. "Those were the chosen. The ones offered to me." Thomas grabbed Eliza's arm. "We have to go. Now." But the shadow blocked their path. "You cannot leave. You are mine now." Eliza felt a cold hand wrap around her heart. She looked at Thomas, fear in her eyes. "What do we do?" Thomas took a deep breath. "We fight." Chapter 7: The Fight. Thomas and Eliza stood their ground, the shadow looming before them. Thomas reached into his coat and pulled out a small silver crucifix. "Stay back," he warned. The shadow hissed, recoiling from the crucifix. "Foolish mortal. Do you think that will save you?" Thomas's grip tightened. "It might." Eliza looked around, searching for anything that could help. Her eyes fell on the altar. "Thomas, the altar. Maybe we can use it." Thomas nodded, understanding. "Go. I'll hold it off." Eliza ran to the altar, her heart pounding. She could feel the shadow's gaze on her, but she focused on the symbols carved into the stone. She traced them with her fingers, trying to decipher their meaning. The shadow lunged at Thomas, who held the crucifix high. "Stay back!" he shouted, his voice trembling. Eliza's mind raced as she studied the symbols. They told a story of an ancient pact, a promise made to the darkness. She realized that the altar was a gateway, a conduit to the other side. If she could close it, maybe they could trap the shadow. "Thomas, I need your help," she called. Thomas glanced back, his face pale. "What do you need?" "Hold the shadow off. I think I can close the gateway." Thomas nodded, his eyes filled with determination. He turned back to the shadow, holding the crucifix steady. "You will not take us," he said, his voice firm. Eliza focused on the altar, her fingers tracing the symbols. She whispered an incantation she didn't fully understand, but felt was right. The air around her grew colder, the shadows pressing in. The shadow howled, its form writhing in agony. "What are you doing?" it demanded. Eliza continued the incantation, her voice growing stronger. The symbols on the altar began to glow, a bright, blinding light emanating from the stone. "Thomas, hold on!" she shouted. The shadow lunged at Thomas, but he stood his ground, the crucifix shining with a holy light. "You will not take us," he repeated, his voice unwavering. The light from the altar grew brighter, enveloping the clearing. The shadow screamed, its form dissolving into the light. Eliza felt a surge of energy, the power of the incantation flowing through her. She closed her eyes, focusing all her will on the altar. With a final, deafening scream, the shadow was pulled into the altar, the light swallowing it whole. The clearing fell silent, the air still and cold. Eliza opened her eyes, her heart pounding. She looked at Thomas, who was panting, but alive. "We did it," she said, her voice trembling. Thomas nodded, his face pale. "We did." Chapter 8: The Aftermath. Eliza and Thomas stumbled out of the forest, their bodies and minds exhausted. The village of Kickapoo was eerily quiet, the mist hanging heavy in the air. They made their way back to the inn, the weight of their experience pressing down on them. The innkeeper met them at the door, her eyes wide with fear. "What happened?" she asked, her voice shaking. Eliza shook her head. "It's over. The shadow is gone." The innkeeper's face softened, relief washing over her. "Thank you," she whispered. "You saved us." Eliza and Thomas exchanged a glance. "It wasn't easy," Thomas said, "but the village is safe now." The innkeeper led them to a table, where they sat in silence, the weight of their ordeal settling over them. Eliza felt a sense of relief, but also a lingering unease. She knew that the darkness was gone, but the memories of what they had faced would haunt her forever. As they sat there, the other guests began to emerge, their faces pale and drawn. They approached Eliza and Thomas, offering their thanks and their stories. Each one had a tale of loss, of fear, of the shadow that had haunted their lives. Eliza listened, her heart heavy with the weight of their stories. She knew that she had done what she could, but the scars of the past would remain. As night fell, Eliza and Thomas retired to their rooms, the events of the day weighing heavily on their minds. Eliza lay in bed, her thoughts racing. She had come to Kickapoo seeking a story, but she had found so much more. Chapter 9. The Farewell. The next morning, Eliza packed her bags, ready to leave Kickapoo behind. She had gathered enough material for her article, but she knew that the story she would tell was far more personal than she had anticipated. Thomas met her at the door, his face lined with fatigue. "Leaving so soon?" he asked. Eliza nodded. "I've got what I need, and I think it's time to go home." Thomas smiled, a weary but genuine smile. "Thank you, Eliza, for everything." Eliza returned the smile. "Take care, Thomas, and keep an eye on the village. They still need you." Thomas nodded. "I will. Safe travels." As Eliza walked to the train station, she felt a sense of closure. She had faced the darkness and come out the other side. The village of Kickapoo had its secrets, but it was a place of resilience, of strength, and she would carry its story with her always. The train whistle blew, and Eliza boarded, looking back one last time at the village that had changed her life. As the train pulled away, she felt a sense of peace. The shadows of Kickapoo would remain, but they would no longer haunt her. She was free. And so, Eliza Hawthorne left Kickapoo behind, the weight of its secrets lifted from her shoulders. The village would continue, its people stronger for what they had faced. And Eliza would carry their story, a testament to the darkness and the light that existed in every corner of the world. The end.